Thanks, Janelle. So welcome everybody to What I Wish I'd Known with Andrea von Wichert. My name is Rachel Andrushuk, and I am the Training Programs Manager at Creative Manitoba. I'd like to acknowledge that Creative Manitoba and Arts Accessibility Network Manitoba are located on Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We also acknowledge that our water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. We acknowledge and pay respect to the ancestors and treaties made on these lands by considering all our cultures, traditions, and the histories of colonialism, dispossession, and resistance as we create and learn together. This is our second last workshop in the Creative Accessibility series, so thank you for joining us today. Our last workshop will be next Saturday, July 3rd, Accessibility for Arts Organizations with Janelle Shaw. And you can register if you haven't already at creativemanitoba.ca/workshops. So with that being said, I will pass the mic to Janelle.
All right, thanks, Rachel. Thank you everyone for joining us today. So the way this is going to work is Andrea is going to give a little bit of a talk, and then afterwards we'll invite everyone to join the discussion. So for now, we're asking everyone to mute themselves and turn off their video while Andrea presents, and then we'll just go like that. So Andrea von Wichert has been lucky enough to sustain a cross-disciplinary, I can't say the word, I'm so sorry.
Cross-disciplinary.
Thank you so much. Art practice for almost 3 decades, all while earning her livelihood in the arts and entertainment industries. An accomplished painter and drawer, she has recently turned her hand to printmaking, which forms the core of a new body of 2-dimensional work numbering in the hundreds. She has worked as a scenic artist, painter, and props builder for 30 years and is currently the head scenic artist at Manitoba Theatre for Young People. She is known as a fearless performer and thought-provoking writer and orator. She has performed her spoken word internationally and has collaborated with orchestral musicians and composers, witch doctors, and various eccentric weirdos. She has produced independent performance and art department heavy short films and live theater. Her creative nonfiction has been published in Prairie Fire magazine and in a number of anthologies designed to rile the patriarchy. She has spent some time studying towards a Master of Arts at the Department of English, Film, and Theater at the University of Manitoba. Thank you so much for doing this workshop with us today, Andrea. I'll pass it over to you.
Great, no problem. I am going to start off just by kind of giving just a general trigger warning. My art is often reflective of aspects of my personal life, and I do have a psychiatric disability and aspects of my life which some people may find upsetting. I don't know necessarily that we're going to get into it here, but sometimes when I talk about my work, those kind of things just slip in because I treat them very banally. And sometimes if people aren't expecting that, it can be upsetting. So that's the first thing I'm going to say. And the second is, please, if while you're listening during this live presentation, you have any questions, put them in the chat, share them with Janelle, and we'll hopefully get to them at the end of this. So Janelle just introduced me. And she was a mouthful to say multidisciplinary artist. And I'm just going to sort of break down what I mean is I work in the visual arts and I have an art practice in the visual arts. And I try to look at these two different things. I have an art practice, which is artwork that I create in and of myself. And I am the creative generator and the creative center of these pieces. And I sometimes work in visual mediums. I sometimes write mostly creative nonfiction. And then I sometimes write and perform what is probably best described as spoken word in terms of a loose description, or some people would say storytelling, some people would say theater. So these are where I'm coming from. And then I also have like an arts job, because I work in the arts and I do a whole bunch of different things. And that's what most people who work in the arts or artists are finding that they need to do in order to survive. So just to give you a sense of my background, I'm a first generation Canadian. My parents were German refugees in the 1950s. But because we live in a society that operates under the auspices of white supremacy, eventually, like for my brother and I, they just passed as normal white Canadians. And so we benefited from all the privileges of a very suburban white upper middle class upbringing. My first introduction to the performing arts was when I was 3 years old. I was enrolled in Yamaha music lessons. And from there, I studied piano and then voice until I was 17. So I did a very classical, very traditional music training with Royal Conservatory up to grade 10 piano and voice. And that was my first exposure to creative thinking and creative being. And to this day, when I structure performances or pieces of writing, I'm usually thinking about it kind of in terms of a musical structure, because that's really what the language that was first ingrained in me. So on one side of my family were fundamentalist, crazy Christians. And then on the other side, I had a paternal grandmother who spoke 5 languages, and she'd been raised in a salon where she had painting classes, and she played the piano, and she was an amazing craftsperson, and her handwork was so I came from this really kind of tension about art. Very high European traditional kind of arts were okay in my home. And because of my grandmother, when I was very young, I went to the ballet, I went to the symphony. So that was sort of sanctioned art. But because of the religious overtones in my home when I was very young, like secular art, especially popular music, rock and roll, was not a part of my life until I became an adolescent, or just before, and sort of like discovered the whole punk rock culture. I'm gonna say I'm 50 years old. So that really colors a lot of my experiences. I've lived most of my life without the internet. I managed to do an undergraduate degree without the internet, and it's not, so my experience of culture at an early age is gonna be very different from people who are younger. I just wanna put that out and there. So from this, eventually I go to the University of Winnipeg Collegiate for my last year of high school. They have a very strong drama program. And eventually I study theater at the University of Manitoba. I get a degree there. And then I had in that time, I'd been working with classmates on fringe plays and other independent projects. And when I went out into the world, I started working in the film industry. And because I had been like designing and painting sets for part of what I was doing at theater school, I was at the Black Hole Theater, where you could basically do and get involved with productions as much as you could. I started painting in film and theater and working in the art department in film. And that really took me away from performance for a while. And I really focused on those other parts of my career. And then in 2001, I sort of had a crisis. I was really tired of the grind of the film industry. It's a really hard industry to work in. And I spent a year in law school in Victoria. And that sort of didn't work. It didn't take. But it really affirmed my desire to professionalize my skills, at least as a fine artist. And I had a solo show in 2004 at the Gas Station Theater, which is an important cultural resource in Winnipeg, where I live. And around the same time, that theater was facing a possible closure. And they were really looking for the community to rally behind them as they restructured and got a new board and tried to like raise money to keep the doors open. And at that time, I first produced what became a gala fundraiser, which involved a curated art show and a cabaret all around a central theme. It was called Girls, 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 and it was for female artists only. And what I saw it as while I produced this show once a year, was that it was a creative incubator. And it would best show off everything that the gas station theater had to offer in terms of a gallery in the lobby and performances in the theater. And that is how I sort of started to prepare to come back to perform, because I had a lot of issues with being mortified with myself and to try to get back on stage. And eventually with that, and I sought out through the Winnipeg Poetry Slam sort of an avenue to start performing. I wound up having performance back in my life and as part of my practice, so that eventually I leveraged the spoken word into traveling around Canada, representing Winnipeg at the Canadian Festival of Spoken Words Poetry Slam, even though that's not really, I am not a performance poet, that's not what I do, but it was a door that opened that I stepped through. Eventually, it hooked me up with the Cluster Festival, which is a integrated arts and new music festival that's run out of Winnipeg. And I was lucky enough to work with some classical musicians and composers. And this led to me going with them to the UK and doing a little tour through London and parts of the UK that ended at the Brighton Fringe Festival. I was lucky enough to travel to New York with Michael Dudek, Witch Doctor, who's a Winnipeg performance artist who's sort of devoting the last 10 or 15 years to a large performance art piece. And I was sort of able to work with him on some things. So I was able to go from not having performed into performing again, just by leveraging all of the little steps. And around the same time that Girls, Girls, Girls was happening, another artist and I, Arlie Ashcroft, we were making one-shot Super 8 films, which are basically, you get a roll of Super 8 film and you film it and you send it away, and the organizers of the festivals we were in develop it. And the first time you see the film is when it's screened. So there's only in-camera editing. And that helped me also to get a lot of on-camera experience. And that's sort of my background to this point where I am today as an artist. I currently have a grant from the Manitoba Arts Council to do a workshop for a show called Trigger Warning. It's part of a series of performance lectures that are under the auspices of the title Trigger Warning. And I'm going to be, for the first time, because most of my art has been just me, or maybe me and a couple of friends producing these things ourselves, finding ways to make them happen, and not under the auspices of a theater company or necessarily an arts institution, because there are ways to be a performer. You can be like a traditional actor, and then that involves auditions and getting an agent and being involved in the film and film and television and theater industry specifically, but that's not what I do for a number of reasons. Mostly what I am doing is writing and creating works for myself. And that's what I have the most experience, or working with a limited number of people on a project-to-project basis. And so this Trigger Warning, a version of it, it is scheduled tentatively to be produced in the fall through Sick and Twisted Theater Company, which is a disabled theater company running out of Winnipeg, Manitoba, which we'll talk about later. And then other performance things I have coming up. I'm supposed to be performing at part of something of the Winnipeg Fringe, but that's in July and I haven't really thought about that. I just finished writing some sketch comedy, and it's really the first time that I got paid to write and perform something like that. And that was kind of like, those sweet jobs rarely come along, but they were quite great. And so in terms of the business of making art for other people and yourself, I think we have to start, there's a couple key things. And I think the first thing that everyone needs to start with, if you want to be a creative person who uses performance, is that you need to constantly be doing what I'd say is an honest self assessment, where you're looking truly at the strengths and weaknesses that you have with regard to a particular project or a deadline. And you never do this just once, because with every project and with time, we're going to learn, we're going to change. And it's always good to check in with yourself. And part of this is that in order to successfully leverage an art career, you have to talk about yourself and your art in a way that's a little self-aggrandizing, because as you're building your bio, you want to make your experience sound as exciting and enticing as possible. And part of this honest self-assessment is that it's really tempting, especially if you have some kind of moderate success, to sort of start believing your own bullshit. And I personally think that that's fatal to the type of art that I'm making. My art is very intimate. I'm mostly interested in like an in-person fueled connection, which makes a talk like this very difficult to me, because I can't see you or feel you in the air or have that emotional togetherness. But so when I do an honest self-assessment, I'm at a stage where I'm pretty good at knowing what my strengths and weaknesses are. So if I was going to assess myself as, I have a great gift for the gab. I'm not worried about finding words or words escaping me. In fact, all of my latest performance things are without a script, because I really wanted to get past being too in love with any individual words that I might come up with. And also, I have a terrible memory, and even my own work, trying to write something and then memorize it causes me so much stress that I thought that there would be another way to structure performance for me. So I'm lucky in that I'm not really so much worried about, am I going to get the right words? I'm pretty literary. I have a good capacity to just show up and talk about things that I know nothing about, and say a bunch of terrible bullshit but I can say it with authority and people. So I'm not so much worried about that. The other thing that I have is that I have a real capacity to create intimacy. So I like to have a smaller space, a smaller audience, and I really want the audience to feel something and to have them go on an emotional journey with me. What I'm not great at is a lot of things to do with social media. I find that overwhelming. A lot of things to do with all of the computer administration that is involved in being a modern artist, I struggle with. That's in part because I do have a disability that causes things like emotional dysregulation and then cognitive function, and it's very hard for me to concentrate sometimes and focus. So that poses a bit of a problem. I also, while I'm good at creating intimacy, I have a bit of a social phobia. I don't like going out into the public to promote my work, which if you're performing at a fringe festival, for example, you must do that. And I've learned that for future projects, if I'm involved in anything that needs that kind of public outreach, I budget someone who I hire, who their job is to actually force me to do those things. So that's kind of something that I do. And other things I would say that in terms of my strengths, because I'm a multidisciplinary artist who also works in the entertainment industry, I work as a scenic artist sometimes. I also work as a story editor sometimes. So I know a lot of people. So I'm linked in to different parts of the artistic community in terms of if I need resources. Not a strength of mine is I don't have close family. That's not I have found that in some ways, the most successful artists that I know generally do have supportive families. And if you have one, never undervalue that resource. The other thing is that when you have an artistic goal, you need to be realistic about your artistic goals. That's the other part, is that very few people can decide at the age of 24 that they're suddenly going to be an acrobat at Cirque du Soleil. So you really need to be realistic about what your skills are, what your goals are, and then to try to figure out your way there is the challenge of anyone who's working within the arts. Another thing that I want to sort of put up at the beginning of this that I really wish I knew, because I feel like I was, again, super naive, is it's very important to think about your boundaries when you're starting off as a performer, because the arts and entertainment industry is often one where the work climate is, it seems like everyone's your friend, because people are friendly, and oftentimes people will be talking about personal things as part of their work, and they seem very open. And there's a big component of the arts that involves like an opening with drinks and food and socializing. And it's really easy to think that everyone is your friend because they're being so nice and friendly, and you think that maybe the arts and entertainment is this like great industry where personal politics and exploitation doesn't happen. It's just masked under that friendliness. And especially when people are new and eager to please and eager to build resumes and eager for feedback, especially from more established artists, there are a lot of predators in the arts, just like there are everywhere else. And you just have to be careful that sometimes people who are promising you future work or promising you, like, if you help them that you'll get A, B, C, or D, that's not actually happening. And that sometimes your employers are treating you like a friend and being so nice to you because they want to actually exploit your love of the arts to get you to work more than what they're paying you for. And I think it's really important, because the work culture is so social and often so casual, for us to remember in the back of our minds that not everyone is our friend. And that's something that I really wish that I had been told when I was younger. What you need to do with difficult people is get the experiences you need to build your resume and your CV. And when you start getting paid gigs, you can become more selective about who you donate your time to. Another big thing about being realistic is that you have to be professional. And there's a night within the theater community right now, the whole idea of that show must go on at all costs, that's being questioned. It's a bit ableist in its dynamics, but still, especially if you're doing something that has a live streaming or live performance component, you actually have to be there on time in order for the thing to happen. And professional skills like that, and to actually know, maybe arriving early enough to know who's who else is working on the project, who are the people that are important, who really is the creative artist behind the project, and also know your place. Or have you been hired just to find your light, say some words, look apart in the assistance of a greater project? Or is this a type of situation where your insight ideas might be welcome? Because most times you're being hired as an outside actor or bringing in as a performer. A lot of times people don't really want to know your opinion. Things have been planned long before you showed up, and you're part of a greater whole. And if that's the case, you should really be aware of where you fit into that and how everything works. It makes you more reliable, a better performer, and protects you from getting like a big head or performer's ego. Another thing I might want to just say is, like, the realities of Manitoba is, if you want to be a movie star or a Broadway star or an art star, move. Don't be here. If you want to be a movie star, go to LA, go to Vancouver, at least, go to Toronto. If you want to be an art star, go to Berlin, go to school in Europe, go somewhere to the US. Don't stay in Winnipeg because we are too small for that to happen to you here. There's also a phenomenon that often Winnipeg is not interested in people from Winnipeg as artists until they've been successful anywhere else. And if you go someplace else, people just accept you're an artist. You don't have to prove it. They treat you much better. And again, it wasn't really until I was starting to do things out of the city and that my career was taken seriously by granting agencies, and I was able to get more money to fund myself. So then we go next. So you've done this assessment. What do you like? You know what your internal resources are. You need to do the same thing with your external resources. And what resources do I have access to? You may not even know. I like to listen to, I like watching interviews of performers that I think are successful, that I think are interesting, that just to hear their stories of where they are. I listen to a lot of stand-up comedians because within the entertainment industry right now, they often have the most power in terms of being showrunners eventually, writing pieces for themselves. They're doing TV, podcasts, movies, live performance. And so they have the most kind of well-rounded experience of being an independent performer. And so looking at people who you admire, for me, it's always part of a research project, component of my work is that I like to watch and hear other performers that I admire, that I like, try to figure out what they're doing, try to decipher what it is. The thing too is, don't underestimate what that volunteer opportunities can provide education and experience, because most of the interesting projects that I've done with other people, I was never paid for and usually had to spend some amount of money to do. Then play the cards that you were dealt with to survive. I don't necessarily like talking about my disability in my personal life. And I get kind of annoyed when people outside, or media especially, or people want to focus on my disability as a disabled artist as opposed to my art. But I have the disability arts card to play. So in terms of having access to residencies and resources, I'm going to claim that title. So if you're really good looking, don't be afraid to get a part or a role or an opportunity based on that. Just like if you have any other skill or attribute, it's what you have, it's the cards you were dealt. You just want to leverage that to get some experience. You want to be on stage or in front of a camera as much as possible as you can, because you need, as part of what you need as a performer, is to really season yourself so you don't get distracted by the camera or the audience, so that you can really focus on your work. And often that is what is happening in your area. Are there open mics? Is there, maybe you don't think you're a stand-up comedian, but there's a stand-up comedy open mic and you write stuff that's sort of funny. Go to the open mic, do that. Then know, after you've done all of your honest self-assessments, you gotta figure out a way to feed yourself. The only thing that is meant by the words professional artist is that when you make art, most of the time someone will pay you. It does not mean I'm paid enough making art that I can survive. Those are two separate things. It's a very small group of people whose personal art practice, like their personal art, and their livelihood coincides for the majority of the time. It's very few people. Most people are struggling to find something that pays enough that you can survive, but that gives you time and energy that you can still do your arts. And it sort of comes down, like when I was in a residency in 2017, and Shauna Dempsey was a mentor of mine, and she's probably arguably one of the most successful performance artists in Winnipeg. And she herself told me that the year before she had only made $3,000 in artist fees. And this is someone who has like reached the pinnacle of success in her chosen field. So you really have to diversify your skills. And the big question is, do I work in an artistic field? Do I do something non-artistic that I can stand doing? Like a lot of people who, if you look at old school punk rock musicians, a lot of them are in the trades. It gives them a job that pays them enough. They're always employable. They have weekends off. They know how to schedule themselves. Other people are teachers or work in the education system, and they focus on the Fringe Festival. And summer vacation is where they do their artistic stuff, and they're doing something else during the rest of the year. Other people make art for other people. You're working within the industry. That's like me being a scenic artist, or it's people who might be stage managers or technicians, even things like sex workers, strippers, designers of all type, editors, people who work in arts administration and who work in academics. Those are sort of the kind of different places where I know artists have found ways to work to keep themselves alive. And I think that we should never, academics is a really good place if you have an aptitude for it. And with that, I include people who are teaching drama. Do not undervalue the importance of effective teachers. I'm talking to about university professors and instructors, though do beware is that everyone and their dog in a creative field now is getting their MA. That the availability of tenure track positions, professorships are much smaller than they used to be, and sessional instructors do not get paid a lot. But going through the process of graduate school can be one way to get an institution that has some kind of infrastructure and other professional network to support your work. There are pros and cons for all of these choices, and finding a work-life balance is never easy. There are times where I have felt very frustrated because all my time and energy is working on other people's projects, and I feel like I'm not having the time to devote to my own. But because I've diversified my income too, I do a little bit of painting and theater, I do a little bit of writing here, I do a little bit of my own work, and nothing's permanent and nothing's full-time. I've sort of managed to find a way where I can balance, and I don't need to be making visual art if I'm in the process of writing a show and working painting in the theater. I can let that aside. And there are also extended periods of time where I'm not making any art. I'm just taking in stimulus from the world that eventually will be used in art. And a big thing I would say is that I can't speak with you that I want to mention is that social media, especially with the pandemic, is opening huge new doors about how to monetize things. And that is not my area of expertise. I do not like social media. I'm not comfortable on it. It makes me very angry and upset. So I don't really participate that much. But I think that, especially if you're a younger performer breaking in, that there are rich, unexplored territories within those fields that some of the newest, exciting, artistic product, I think, are going to be in that. I want to go back to what I think is what I'm going to call the strategic limitations of a project, because if you're just thinking about making art in your head and you have endless limitations and you can imagine, you're only limited by your imagination, it's really hard to get started because you could do anything, say anything, try anything, everything is possible. So I like to really look at what is limiting my artistic opportunities or what I'm doing. And these limits allow me a structure that I can operate in it. And the first one is always funding. How are you going to fund your art? Some people are independently wealthy. Some people work and use their own savings to fund their art. Some people marry rich. And it might sound like a terrible thing to say or kind of funny, but many of the artists who are most successful and satisfied in their practice are married to doctors, lawyers, dentists. And it's a sad reality, but it is the fact that arts and creative people are not funded very well in our culture. And so you got to do what you got to do. With that, the limits of where you're getting your money from and how much money you have to spend is going to provide the biggest limitation on what you can do creatively. The other things are, where are you going to be performing this piece? How much time are you being asked? What's the time limit on your piece? Is it are you writing? I like to write to a time limit. I like to write to a word count, because then I can chart the experience that I want the audience to have over time and then create to that. And I always think that having 3 minutes of really good is better than 5 minutes of meh. You definitely want the audience to leave the audience wanting more and not to wish that you'd stopped 5 minutes ago. But that's my practice. It depends on what your attitude is to the audience. And certainly there are performers and artists who really don't care what the artist is experiencing, but that's not the audience is experiencing, but that's not for me. The other thing to think about is like the whole granting system. I'm going to just touch briefly is that eventually as an artist, you can apply for grants. And if you are successful, there can be public funding. You have to look at a grant. When you write a grant, you're applying to be part of a lottery. There are always more applicants with great projects than there is available funding. The benefit of writing a grant is it forces you to write about your art in a way that makes you refine your ideas to really know what you're good about. It's a great experience. I would encourage everyone to do that. And a lot of times if you start with what's called a professional development grant, that's a little bit easier to get. And then you can sort of use that to maybe get a residency, which is a dedicated time spent. A lot of times you can go away, sometimes it's in your own city or focused on art. There are lots of residencies you can find out online. You can find out through the Manitoba Arts Council. And oftentimes, if you get a residency to work on a specific project, you can get a grant to go to the residency, and you sort of like leverage all of these experiences to keep building on what funding you have available. And I also want to talk about that there's 2 ways that I go about creating. And one is I kind of like to say it's like, there is something that I kind of refer to as the punk rock proof, which is sometimes you'll find yourself in a situation where you don't feel prepared. You're suddenly being asked to do something. You don't really know what's going to go on. You're not really sure of your material. The punk rock has proved that you don't need to know what you're doing. It's better to know that if you don't know what you're doing, as long as whatever it is doing, you are firm in your convictions and your attitudes, that you will create something that is effective and entertaining. And then the flip side of that is that sometimes, like for me personally, I have better fluid intelligence than operational intelligence. So for me, the first performance is always better than the second or third. And after the first one, there's a process of refinement and rehearsing and practicing that you kind of bring craft into your process. And then the challenge when you're working that way is, how do you keep spontaneity? How do you keep things fresh? And the one last thing I'm going to say about residencies is that, having talked to other artists and myself, is don't be surprised or disappointed if the residency turns out to be nothing like you planned or you expect it to be. I have never gone into any of those situations and accomplished what I thought I would. Usually I kind of feel disappointed in what I'm accomplishing until much later, when you can more realistically reassess what you're doing. And if you're looking, a really good way to motivate yourself to keep making art is to look and constantly be seeking opportunities through calls for submissions. And for me, I am a member of a few professional associations, like Manitoba Arts for Women as Art, MAWA, and the Manitoba Writers Guild. I subscribe to the WAC newsletter. I have the Arts Accessibility newsletter come to me, and a few other places, and they will list opportunities. And then on Facebook and the internet, you know, people know how to Google. You can find out those opportunities and then apply for things, meet deadlines. The more that you apply for things, the more that you're forced to write about your art, the more that you're forced to put yourself out there, the more comfortable and confident you're going to become with that whole thing. And then I want to talk about the actual getting into the process of making the art. Right now, I'm going to be walking into a workshop for this trigger warning project that I'm working on. I first conceptualized it in 2016, and I had imaginings with bells and whistles and a whole bunch of things that I couldn't afford. And the first time that I got to work on the project, all I had was 10 minutes on stage, part of a cabaret. So the piece that I created for that was very different than anything that I had imagined, but it was a first step in getting towards the opportunity of maybe realizing an idealized production. And there is a process in creating your own work, especially if it's anything that makes you emotionally vulnerable, where when you start to get it on its feet, in front of an audience, and even if it's just one person, your friend, a director, a dramaturge, whoever, it's really mortifying. And I don't know anyone who's doing really interesting, really personal work that's honest and true, who does not have to face this real self-mortification the first times you're putting things on stage and presenting it. You just have to kind of get used to it. And eventually it becomes like a tool and a sign that you can use that you're on your way. In the same light, most creative people I know, they go through part of the process. It seems like there's a lot of procrastination, and they feel like a fraud, and they feel like an imposter, and they have nothing to offer. And it feels like an incredible waste of time when you're in that space, but somehow it seems to be a necessary part of the process. At least most people I know spend a lot of time in that uncomfortable place. So I just want to emphasize that the hard work and the feeling unsure and the pressure of it is all part of it. Is that a lot of times we have a romantic notion of what it might be to be creative. And there's a lot of that fun stuff that's involved with it. But don't be alarmed or surprised or upset if this process of constantly honestly assessing what you have to offer, your strengths and weaknesses, and then going within to offer up something to people that's very personal initially, it's not easy. And it's okay to be uncomfortable. And most people are uncomfortable for points of it. And that's why, again, I say try to get as much experience anywhere as possible, because your seasoning helps you to sort of ride out that discomfort some more. And at this point, I kind of want to check in with Janelle to see if there are people who have questions and queries. I'd love to, if there are people watching the live stream and not watching this as a recording, I'd love if they have questions about their art practice or things they want to talk about. I'd like to open up that floor. So Janelle, what do we have going on?
So at the minute, there's nothing in the chat, but if anyone has any comments or questions, feel free to turn your video on, unmute yourself, write in the chat, anything. But while we're waiting, I have a question.
Please.
I was lucky enough to see Trigger Warning, Satan Made Me Do It back in March 2020 with Cryptic.
Yes.
And for me, someone who's a psychiatric survivor as well, I found it just amazing to watch you do this performance. So I'd like to know from you, how did it feel for you to do this honest performance about that? Was it empowering, cathartic, scary?
All of the above. It seems, especially since I've started doing this process where I don't really have a script, I just have ideas and I write them over and over again. Until the first performance, I have days before that where I'm terrified and I feel that I'm making the biggest mistake of my life and that I have nothing to offer. And I think it's actually a necessary part of that performance because it's hard to describe this online. It's easier to do it if I could show you if we were in the same room. It's hard to describe it online. But I want to be as vulnerable on stage as I possibly can be. And I also want to be like, get over myself and my embarrassment and my hang-ups. So it sort of is like all of my insecurities happened before. And it's really intense. And I combat that with, I do so much, like I read, I'm very intellectual about the research part of my work. Like Trigger Warning Satan was like a result of 9 months of intense reading and writing and thinking all behind. So I use that sort of as my cushion and also to distract me from my fear. But usually now that I have been performing long enough is I like to take a half hour. I like to do a vocal warm up. I like to do a couple things. And when I've gone through that ritual and I'm waiting for it to start, it's calm. And then when it's working on stage, it's very gratifying because you're collaborating with the audience to create an emotional experience. And it's my hope that by putting myself in a position where I'm especially vulnerable and letting the humor of that kind of influence the audience, that they kind of feel a measure of relief about whatever. I personally think that the vast majority of people have something that they feel about themselves or a situation that they're either obsessing about or that they're hiding from themselves or other people, that they don't feel really good about themselves, because that's the culture we live in. The economic system that we live in is dependent upon us feeling terrible about ourselves so that we go out and buy stuff. And my hope is to sort of, by talking about those parts of my own life, especially because I do have a psychiatric disability, it has affected my life in ongoing, really difficult, negative ways. It's an invisible disability, which means that until you find the right experts or people who know about it, you're being told there's nothing wrong with you except for you're lazy or crazy or you're choosing. So it's a very hard thing to try to manage. And I'm sure I'm not the only person who doesn't feel that they're meeting cultural expectations or whatever the topic might be. So for me, that show, like Satan, was very gratifying because it all came together in that first performance in a way that I knew not only had I done what I needed to do for that moment, but that actually with a bit of rejiggering, I had a cultural product that I can now take to Fringe festivals or other shows. And there's an amazing feeling of satisfaction in the moment. I'm not really good at resting on those laurels and taking like being in that, okay, like this, I did this thing and I'm going to sort of like relish it and sit in it. For me, it was the research and going through the process and the performance. And once I'm done that, or I'm done like making a body of work of art, or I'm writing, I'm really like, okay, what's next? So unless the piece has like a life of its own, which the Satan piece I think is a standalone piece, and I sort of have hopes that it will take me maybe to the Edinburgh Festival once that happens to be live again. It's just, there's a lot of possibility with it.
Yeah, it was really wonderful. And for anyone who hasn't seen it, I'm happy to announce it's going to be happening again in September 16th at the Art Gallery of Southwestern Manitoba in Brandon. And we'll also be recording it so that people can watch it live through their computers. But just as I said, as someone with psychiatric illness as well, it was just so powerful to see myself on stage in a way. So, and for me, that's really what disability art is. So I thought it was amazing. We do have a question now.
Oh,
I
okay.
believe it's, oh, Ted, do you want, you
I
unmute yourself. We'll
was
do it after.
I
Go
was
ahead.
gonna as well. No, but somebody else came before me, so that's fine.
Okay, so then we'll do Susan Aiden Abbott's first, and then we'll talk to Ted. So
Okay.
Susan says, "Thank you, baby. Excellent talk. Love what you said about the discomfort. Discuss. Come to believe that it is important for my practice, as I use that as a sign that I'm being totally vulnerable and authentic, embracing the ugly. How do you push through taking on social expectations, displeasing people? Do you just stand strong in yourself and your work?"
Well, I guess I'm kind of lucky in that I have a kind of unpleasant, pig-headed, reactionary part of my personality. And like, since I'm pretty provocative, just in general, and since I was little, I don't really deal well with authority, especially institutional authority. So I'm kind of don't really fit in to, I don't really fulfill social expectations in the first place. And I think for me, like, when I was 9 years old, my parents had a German magazine that some distant relative sent that said, I have this article that said, Hilfe, unsere Kinder sind Punker. And it was punk kids in Germany in like 1980. And that kind of blew my mind as a 10-year-old who was being raised by fundamentalist Christians, because that attitude, I identified with it. So it's hard for me because I do have this provocative part, and I can't often keep my mouth shut to my own detriment sometimes. And I do have I'm compelled to challenge and be provocative, but at the same time, I'm also very sensitive. And that, if I'm making my list, my honest self-assessment is that I'm too sensitive to what people like. I'm too sensitive to disappointment. So I'm always doing a dance between balancing, I guess, what is an innate nature to kind of say, fuck you, which has served me well in some occasions, but is terrible and has served me poorly in others. And I think, again, I turned 50 this year, and I think I'm only now feeling like I'm kind of almost able to kind of negotiate and balance when. It's an ongoing struggle. And but I do have a natural unpleasantness that I can bring out that makes it kind of natural for me.
A great response. Ted, feel free to ask your question now.
My question, can you hear me? Just
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. No, my question really is just, I know your talk has been very honest in terms of a lot of the things that we all go through, and your art practices are really quite extensive in terms of all of the various aspects that you do. And I just wondered what part of it brings you to the desire to be a performer? Like, why is this a strong element of your art practice?
It has always, like, from when I was in Yamaha music, it was always something like I was chatty, I was talky, and I think too, it's like a lot of artists, it comes from like the family system that I come from. That's how you learned how to please people and diffuse tension, is you learn how to be funny and you kind of perform when you need to. And I also got a lot of positive feedback from other adults in the world, which for me, both my parents had mental illness. And when you're a kid with mental illness or psychiatric disability and cognitive impairments, and your parents are struggling, but not admitting it, or that tension, I'm sure, has a lot to do with where the performance comes, because it is always been there. I was like the community theater kid, where like at spring break, my parents would put me in the city drama program, and I was like in the elementary school play, and I was in the high school. It was just, it's just something that was always there. And I've always had an aptitude for speaking in front of people. I'm not scared of talking to people who have more power and status than I have. And I've never been. So all of those factors, I think, combine. And there's something when you can share a kind of emotional purity with an audience in real time together that is irreplaceably satisfying to me personally. And yeah, so I guess it kind of comes from mostly being a broken, psychologically damaged human, but I think that's where a lot of performers do start.
Right. Oh, yeah. No, that's very honest. Thanks. That helps a lot.
Great. And then we got 2 more comments in the chat. So
Sure.
Sylvia says, no question, just thank you, Andrea, for your openness. I wish I had known quite a few of the points you mentioned. In the beginning of my career, I was very naive. I wish I had known. I could have protected myself better.
For sure. And I just want to, like, especially for younger people who are starting off, I can't emphasize more about really have your head about yourself when you're starting out, especially if you're doing stuff like fringe festivals or things that have a social component to them where there's a lot of drinking and drug use. Because I have seen too many instances of either senior artists wanting to exploit newbies for their time, energy, and ideas, or where it's purely a situation where performers, and it's of all genders, are just traveling around the country and they're looking to put notches on their bedpost. And they find that by finding a young artist, and it's kind of like, oh, I really like your work, I think that you're up and coming, like, the compliments to a young artist. And when you're hearing that from a more established art, it's really seductive. And unfortunately, and I'm not saying that every time a senior artist is interested in your work, it's because they want to have sex with you. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that there is an underbelly to the arts world that is rarely addressed, because our work culture is cordial, it's friendly, and it's casual, right? We talk to each other, we refer to each other by our first names often. We're dealing with really intimate material, sometimes, and personal material. And that means that you have to be way more conscious of your boundaries than you would be in any other job, while at the same time, the work culture is asking you to put your boundaries down. And also, let's face it, is that until very recently, institutional art opportunities were mostly run by men. And until recently, the idea that if you were a man in a high arts institution, that you could use that to like find women to have sex with was perfectly acceptable. It was part of the culture. And the remnants of that is still there. And it's something that no one wants to talk about, because I think we feel so threatened as an arts community because we're dependent on government funding and there's never enough money and we don't live in an arts literate culture. So there's a lot of reasons for that. And yeah, I was terribly naive when I started out, and I think it hurt me and it wasted my time and energy.
Absolutely. And Heather Witherden also kind of agrees with that. She says, thanks for speaking about the culture of the arts. Thankfully, I started later so I could see through a lot of the manipulation.
Mm-hmm. And I think that we are now, because of all the Me Too stuff that has happened, and because of the discussion of white supremacy within traditional arts institutions, I think that we're now at a place where we can start having these conversations and really talk about how do we want the like how do we change arts culture. And really it means, I think, more women, more queer people, more BIPOC, even though I hate that acronym, more within our communities, greater diversity. That's what's gonna weed out this sort of culture of entitlement and exploitation.
Absolutely. So we'll end it with one last comment from Rachel, who says, love natural unpleasantness. She loved that term. So what I'd like to do is invite everyone who wants to turn on your video, turn on your sound, say thank you to Andrea. This was just such a amazing, open, personal talk. You know, it's real talk, which we don't get very often.
Oh, it's so good to see people's faces.
So put your cameras on, say hello.
I can't put my camera on. I can't put
Hi,
my camera on.
We
I
can
think
hear you.
yeah.
Hello.
Yeah. Thank you very
Oh,
much.
it's so
was
great
a
to see you
great-
all.
it was- Thank you,
Yeah.
Andrea. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for all
And
so much.
I'll finish up by saying that when Creative Manitoba is doing their online coaching, is
Yep.
that I have been lucky enough to be acting as an online coach. And what
Oh.
thrills me more than anything is to talk to artists who are maybe stuck or needing some advice in actualizing a project. And we can go through your work and talk about like ways that you can move forward. So if any of you ever are looking for that kind of service, I love talking to artists about their art, especially if it's new work, and talking about ways that you can actualize that in the real world. So I'll stop.
Great.
We're,
Okay.
we're
Yeah.
running the program again in the fall, so
All righty. Great. Thanks
All
for
right.
your help. And
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea.
this was so great. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you all.
Thank you. Thank
bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.